Welcome everyone to the final online Peace Science Colloquium presentation of the 2017-2018 academic year. I'm Emily Hencken Ritter, and I'm assistant professor at the University of California, Merced. I am joined today by Kaitlyn Webster, who is a PhD student at Duke University. She is presenting her paper today, which is entitled Rethinking Civil War Onset and Escalation. And this paper won the Stuart Bremer Award, which is for presented to the greatest, the greatest, yes, but the best graduate student paper presented at the Peace Science Society annual meeting in November of 2017. So congratulations to Katie for this fantastic award. That means that she will present this paper today to us, to anyone who is watching. And it also means that she'll present her paper to the NEPS conference, right? Which is in
June.
Italy, right?
Yeah.
Italy in June, yes, wonderful. We are joined today by four excellent discussants that we're super excited to have with us. We have Dr. Bethany Lucena, who is an assistant professor of political science at Rochester, University of Rochester. We have Janet Lewis, who is an assistant professor of political science at the U.S. Naval Academy. We have Bill Reed, who is a professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. And we also have Joe Young, who is a brand new minted full professor at American University with a joint appointment in the School of Public Affairs and the School of International Service. Thank you, all of you, for coming today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie for a 15-minute presentation.
All right, thank you. Let me just share my screen. All right, can everyone see?
Looks great.
Perfect. So I just wanted to take a minute and thank you, Emily, thank the Peace Science Society for having me, and to thank my discussants for not only agreeing to read the paper, but provide some feedback. So as Emily mentioned, the title of the paper is Rethinking Civil War Onset and Escalation. Since the end of World War II, civil wars have surpassed interstate wars as the most common form of violent conflict. In fact, between 1946 and 2012, over half of all countries experienced a civil war. But there's a lot of variation in what those conflicts actually look like on the ground, particularly in regard to intensity. So, for example, with self-determination disputes, only about half experience any violence at all. And of those that do, only about 20 to 25% escalate to war. This variation is both cross-national and also within country. In Nigeria, the Yoruba movement has been completely peaceful, but the Biafran Rebellion led to an incredibly brutal civil war back in the 1960s. So the question becomes, how can we explain this variation in violence intensity? Why do some conflicts escalate to war and others don't? The motivation for this project really starts with the canonical research on Civil War onset, which looks really at the unconditional probability of war. So it doesn't take into account all of the strategy, all of the process that goes on before countries cross that threshold. And I argue that that's problematic both theoretically and methodologically. There is a newer body of research done in large part by several of my discussants that's starting to unpack the process and the strategy behind the initial onset of violence. But we still don't really know too much about what happens after that initial outbreak. So how does the information, the experience gained through this initial violence drive later escalation or not? Are the mechanisms the same? Are they different? And so on. And I would argue that the ability to answer these questions are key, not only for us as academics, but also for policymakers, for people that are interested in identifying and trying to mitigate both where conflicts are likely to emerge and
Katie?
yes.
Oh, sorry, we couldn't hear you for that last little bit. Or I couldn't, anyway. Okay.
Sure. So I was just saying, and I apologize for that.
No, that's fine.
That I think the ability to answer this question is important, not just to academics, but also to policymakers and to people that are interested in trying to manage and prevent conflict emergence and escalation. And so the way I try and address this is through a theoretical framework that looks at low-intensity violence and war together, that looks at them as two qualitatively distinct stages in the broader civil conflict process. So these stages are, like I said, distinct, but they're related. So the prospect of war, for example, is going to influence the strategic behavior early on, and what actors learn in the initial violence is going to then drive behavior later on. And additionally, the mechanisms that matter for the first stage might not matter or might matter in different ways at the second stage. I focus in particular on three mechanisms: the state's capacity, the information environment, and the rebel groups that are in operation. And to really dig into this, I use an EITM type approach. And so I start with a formal model that focuses on two strategic actors, the government and a rebel group, and nature is also involved. And so the rebel group can be one of three types, what I call inactive, weak, or strong. And the government doesn't know the rebel group type. So I actually include two different stages of informational updating for the government. What does the model actually look like? This is a picture of the main subgame. And basically the setup to the model is that the government knows that it's facing an aggrieved population. So it knows that some portion of its citizens are unhappy with the status quo, but it doesn't know the extent of that dissatisfaction. And specifically, it doesn't know if it's actually facing a rebel group that's capable of violently mobilizing sufficiently so as to contest the state. So the government has to move first before it knows this information, and it can choose to repress or accommodate. And I use accommodate here to try and distinguish from more targeted negotiations, right? So the idea would be something like easing cultural restrictions or maybe easing a curfew rather than something more focused like a prisoner swap. After the government moves, the rebel group gets to go, and it can either mobilize or not. If it doesn't, the game ends and the status quo holds. If it does mobilize, it pays a cost for that mobilization, which is based on the group's type, on the state's capacity, and on whether or not that mobilization occurs after repression or accommodation. After that initial move by the rebel group, the government updates its beliefs, and then nature moves, and with some probability, the rebel group is going to survive. Assuming it does, the government updates its beliefs a second time, and then the government has to decide whether or not to go to war or to negotiate with the groups. If it surrender, or they can fight, and if it negotiates, the rebels can accept or fight. In either case, if the rebels fight, victory is determined probabilistically. Okay, I focus on one particular equilibrium. There are definitely multiple possibilities, but I look at the one that I think is the most informative, particularly with regard to the mechanisms that I'm interested in. And this is a separating equilibrium where the government represses, and only the strong type of rebel group is going to mobilize after that repression. Because of that, the government's able to update its beliefs and can recognize that it's facing a strong rebel group. And so it winds up negotiating rather than going to war, and the rebel group is going to accept. There are three key takeaways that I like to take from this equilibrium in the model more broadly, one for each of the mechanisms that I'm interested in. The first is about the information environment. And there's a quote here from David Shedd, who used to be the acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And he said that the Department of Defense spends an inordinate amount of time and effort on the pursuit of indications and warning. And I use this quote because I think it really highlights the informational asymmetry, the informational disadvantage that the state is facing early on. So when we typically think in the interstate conflict about incomplete information, right, the actors might not know the other's resolve or their capabilities or their payoffs, but they know who they're facing. So the US might not be sure about how Russia is going to handle airstrikes in Syria, but it knows it's facing Russia, it knows it's facing Syria. It's very different when we're looking at the early stages of a civil conflict. So the government oftentimes doesn't know if it's facing a group, who that specific group is, let alone the capability and the resolve. And that means that that initial low-intensity violence can really provide a lot of information. The other implication here is that this should affect when we're likely to see negotiations, with negotiations being more likely after initial violence. So I would argue that this mechanism is relevant for temporal as well as cross-national variation, especially when we're thinking about variations in terms of state surveillance infrastructure. The second mechanism is about state capacity. And here there's, the intuition is that there's a selection effect at play, right? So that stronger states are going to deter most of their challengers, at least initially. Most rebel groups just aren't going to want to fight against a stronger state. But if an opponent does emerge, the stronger states are the ones that are actually more likely to escalate to war because they're more confident in their probability of victory. And so I'll just flag that this is pretty different from the conventional wisdom, right? This idea that state capacity might have two different effects at each of the different stages. And so the empirical hypothesis here is that stronger states are less likely to experience low intensity violence, but if they do, they're more likely to escalate to war. Moving on to the third mechanism, opposition group type. Here I'm talking about capacity and resolve. And the idea is that out of all possible rebel groups, only a very specific subset is likely to progress to violence. So weak groups are typically going to get weeded out or just strategically say, nope, this is not for me. And if we do see multiple types, the state is more likely to bargain with stronger groups because these are the ones that present the greater threat. So here the hypothesis becomes that stronger groups are more likely to reach low intensity violence, but less likely to escalate to war if they do. How do I actually test all of this? So first I'll say a brief note about the university cases. So I'm looking at Kaitlyn Cunningham's data on self-determination movements. So these are all self-determination movements worldwide between 1960 and 2005. And I choose this case set rather than maybe the more typical country rebel year because it provides a really clean set of nothing happens that I can then compare to cases of low intensity violence. And then of those cases with low intensity violence, I can compare which ones do and don't. I draw heavily on the quantitative IR literature to show that a Hencken selection model is what's appropriate here. And so the first equation, the dependent variable is going to be low intensity violence. And the second equation for that model, it's going to be war. In terms of independent variables, I use a territorial base variable to look at group strength, and then logged GDP per capita to get its state capacity. So this slide shows the output of some of the main models. And so you see two coefficient plots here. The first one is looking at the results for that first Hencken equation for low intensity violence, two different models that I've run there. And then the second plot is looking at the Hencken equation for war. There's two things that I want to flag here, especially for time purposes. The first, if you look at the third from the bottom, the territorial base variable for low intensity violence is positive. And if we move to the second plot, it's negative. And so what this means is that groups with a base are in fact more likely to reach low intensity violence. But if they do, they're then less likely to make it to war. Conversely, if we look at the top of the plots, second from the top, the GDP per capita variable, this is negative for low intensity violence and positive for war. And so here the fact that the signs slip in general, I think, is particularly interesting. And again, the takeaway is that states with higher GDP per capita are less likely to have that initial low intensity violence. But if they do, they're then actually more likely to go to war. Because that's very different from the canonical and conventional Civil War onset literature, I run a second set of analysis that tries to replicate that initial research using this set of cases, just to make sure that my findings are not an artifact of the case set. And so this slide shows a comparison between the Hencken and the probit results for war. And you'll see, so the Hencken results are in red and the probit are in blue. And two things should stand out. One is that I can replicate on this case set those probit findings, those initial conventional research findings. And the second is just that there's a lot that changes when we adopt this Hencken approach. And so most noticeably, again, if you look at GDP per capita, we see that the sign shifts completely. And countries with greater GDP per capita are actually more likely to go to war once we account for that low intensity violence. Just to very briefly go through a couple of quick conclusions. The first thing I'd really like to emphasize is that this paper develops a novel formal theoretical framework for the interplay between low intensity violence and war and civil conflict. And I think it really emphasizes why we need to account for both stages in research moving forward. It also identifies a key distinction between inter and intrastate conflict, and that is that the information problems and asymmetries are even more extreme for civil conflicts. And then third, I do try and draw on quantitative international relations work in order to identify the most methodologically appropriate way of handling some of these concerns. And so with that, I will say thank you, and I'm looking forward to everyone's feedback.
Thank you, Katie. And with that, we'll open it up to our discussants. We'll start with Bethany.
So I think I'll start with kind of just the obvious brush clearing question. Are you thinking about war as the second stage of your model, you know, the escalation decision? And obvious question is, war doesn't actually occur in the model. And I'm a little skeptical that the nonlinearities in the hypotheses are coming from the model. And, you know, this is just, is this a, I'm going to fix it in future research, or I'm going to take this in a different direction and not do this model, or where's that?
Sure. So I'll say, to get at your main point about war not occurring in the main equilibrium, agreed. I think comparative statics, unfortunately, was something I just couldn't get into in the verbal presentation here, just for time constraints. But that actually points to when war is likely to occur. So for example, the equilibrium doesn't hold once that state capacity parameter gets too high, because the state's just going to go to war. It's not going to bother negotiating, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then I guess to get at your second question, you're asking about, I guess, could you just maybe rephrase it? I think some of it cut out a little bit.
So to clarify your first answer, in the event where the equilibrium falls apart if the state always prefers war, why aren't the rebels deterred in that case?
Because, so sometimes, right, if the group is particularly strong, right, it might also believe that it has a good chance of winning, and it might be sufficiently dissatisfied with the status quo that it's willing to take that chance.
Okay.
Let's have Joe.
Thanks. I should first say this is, I understand why you won an award for this. This is a very, very good paper, very thought-provoking. I think it's an outstanding puzzle and a real decent critique of kind of the state of the Civil War literature. The question I have, the first question I have is kind of like a big think question that I don't have an answer to, so I don't necessarily expect you to have an answer to it. But it seems like a lot of the Civil War literature thinks about civil war as this thing that just happens, and it's a kind of violence that we need to understand. You're suggesting that it's a kind of violence connected to another kind of violence, and we have to understand those two processes together. A third way to think about it is that these are all repression-dissent dynamics, which Emily's probably laughing at me for, that these are repression-dissent dynamics that are all connected, and they're just part of an underlying spectrum of state-dissident interactions. And so I guess I'm wondering, is that an explicit choice you're making, and what are the consequences of that choice, and what if we thought about in these other sorts of ways?
Okay.
Thanks. I actually have thought about that, or does somebody else want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Great. So I have actually thought about that question. And one of the things that I was really struggling with when I first approached this project was where really to bracket off the pieces of the puzzle that I was looking at, right? Because I think you could extend this further, right? So looking at repression dissent more broadly, looking at the micro foundations of when rebel groups emerge, right? Like Janet does. But I wanted to have some place that felt a little bit more like I could actually wrap my arms around it. And so I started with the approach that I'm taking, this low intensity violence and war, because it felt a little bit cleaner to tackle, both theoretically and methodologically, at least to start. So one place that I'd like to take this project in the future is to expand it a little bit more and to get into some of these broader dynamics that might be at play, some of the repression that occurs even before my model starts, for example.
Okay, Bill.
Okay. Thanks for letting me read the paper. It's really fun to read something like this. I can see why it won the award. I think it's really promising. I've got basically two sets of comments, and I'll give you one set right now, and then when we get to the empirical section, we can talk about that. So when I read the appendix, what I understand from the model is that the rebels that are threatened always have a credible threat to fight back. So they always fight if they're threatened. Given mobilization, the government never has a credible threat to go to war. Rebel groups that are offered negotiated settlement never have a credible threat to fight. And when repressed, rebel groups never bluff. Weak groups never mobilize. Strong groups always mobilize. And governments never accommodate. And so the thing that struck me about that was that everything is non-probabilistic, and they don't match up with the hypotheses in all cases. So I think this is what Bethany was pointing to. So for example, the state capacity hypothesis is inconsistent with the idea that governments never go to war if they get to that point. So I have some ideas about how you might change the model, but I just wanted to let you jump in and respond to those comments.
So let's have
Sure.
Katie respond, and then we'll go back to Bill.
Okay, thanks. So I think I push back against that a little bit. Yes, in obviously the current equilibrium, I think actually one of the nice features is that because it's separating, the outcomes are a little bit cleaner. One, I think, obviously there are semi-separating and pooling equilibrium where stuff does become more probabilistic. But more importantly, the equilibrium doesn't hold across all of the parameter values, right? And I think that's where some of the utility for the model can really be brought in. And I do apologize that I didn't include that in the initial presentation. But, right, so the government would prefer to go to war, for example, if it's if the capacity is strong enough, if we vary mobilization costs, right? Again, the equilibrium would break down in an interesting way because we get mobilization from different group types and things like that.
Okay, I think I can understand that.
Okay, we'll take Bill, and then Bethany has a two-finger after Bill.
Okay, I'll just kind of wrap it up with the ideas that I had that are probably, some of them may not be relevant based on your comments. I don't get why you have them moved by nature, other than it being descriptive. You know, at the accommodation part of the game, I would just end the game there. I don't see any reason to have the whole tree go down. If the government accommodates, you could just have payoffs that reflect that. And I think that if you allow for the possibility of bluffing by weak rebels, you're going to get some really interesting stuff happening. And I think the way to do, one way to do this would be to have two-sided uncertainty about the value of the good that the state and the rebel group are negotiating over. And if you did that, that would make this much more consistent with a lot of crisis bargaining models that are already out there in the literature, and kind of would place you in a broader literature if that's something that you found desirable.
Thank you.
Let's take Bethany and then Katie.
Bill just sort of did a better job asking my question, so I'll just clarify one last time why I'm worried about the comparative statics, and then kind of let it go. Just as a general feature, an informational model like always has trouble making anything happen for a long time. Informational models just tend to truncate really quickly. And looking at your model, I don't know that you could get your comparative statics if you were letting the government make continuous offers. That comparative static on state capacity, I think, need to revisit and see if it's kind of inherently plausible, but I don't know that it comes out of the model.
Okay, thank you. I definitely agree with that concern and can take a second look. And I also just want to say thank you to Bill for the suggestion about the bluffing. I do like that and think it would be a really interesting way to go with the model.
Janet?
Oh. Sorry, now can you hear me? I think, so not a formal model, or leave that to Bill and Emily, but so I focused a lot on the informal discussion of the theory, which first let me just say I thought was actually overall, based on my own field work and actually being steeped in the counterinsurgency literature recently, and even like Mao's writings, like I actually think that you're moved in a very promising direction, and like the informational dynamics are what's driving a lot of the differences in the early stage conflicts versus the later stages, and that governments really don't know a lot about rebels in the very initial stages, and that violence helps reveal a lot. But what was missing for me, it sounded to me, based on the informal description, you were talking sort of, it was like the government was a strategic actor and taking in a lot of the new information gain, and the rebels sort of almost weren't very much. Like they were just sort of, you know, doing what they were doing, and there was not a lot of strategic reading on their part of what was going on with the government. Was their understanding of the government's capabilities? Wasn't stated in the write-up? Like, do they have a clear understanding always of the government's resolve to fight back? And maybe this points to, you know, Bill's suggestion of adding in some bluffing. But even just sort of going back to basic Furon 95, right? How we think about bargaining. Right, and war, we should see, I want to know more about just what violence is a function of for you, because it just didn't make sense, especially the finding about the second stage and the higher capacity states are more likely to go to war because they expect to win. Well, if they expect to win and then we get to 1,000 battle deaths, there has to have been, I think, some sort of mistake, right? If they, on their part or the rebels' part, or the rebels were just very extreme, echoing one of Bethany's earlier points. Why did the rebels actually ever get started if the state was so very strong that they were going to sort of confidently jump in and go to war and not negotiate? So I just want to know a little bit more about, yeah, why we see 1,000 battle deaths as the outcome of some of these decisions, and why it's, I think we usually think of war as the outcome of some sort of incentives to misrepresent often one's capabilities. And so, knowing more about particularly this rebels as a strategic actor, I think would help a lot.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I'll just say to start, I do agree with a lot of what you're saying. And I think one of the takeaways that I'm getting is the need to kind of include uncertainty on the rebel side in the model. Obviously, in reality, empirically, I think that uncertainty about the state's resolve or the state's capacity is most likely going to characterize the rebel strategy and thought process. I didn't include it in the model initially because I really wanted to focus on the state's informational asymmetry and the state's informational disadvantage. That seemed like not more interesting, but really what I wanted to kind of dig in on. But I definitely take your point about the rebels also often being in the dark. And that's something that I can incorporate.
We have an open queue. Joe.
All right, I was thinking I would do an informal poll of everyone. Because one of the things that bugs me, but maybe it doesn't bug other people, is I feel like that the story is about a rebel group and the state, and yet the data are not like that. And so I would prefer other data being used. And I understand you used several times this term clean, and this is better for the X number of reasons. But I think this unit of observation is more appropriate. So I don't know if other people agree or disagree.
So you think it should be dyadic?
I think it probably should be dyadic, yeah.
Bethany.
So I was thinking it already was semi-dyadic, since it's got it's kind of the ethnic group on the other side, and like there are ethnic groups that are sort of latent rebel groups versus ones that already have a rebel group. I suppose I really should have just let Katie answer her own question.
Thank you. No, so you're right, Bethany. It is dyadic, and I think I might have misspoke earlier, but the case set is looking at all self-determination movements, but the actual unit of observation, the individual rows, right, are the self-determination movement state dyad year, right? So the country that the self-determination movement is operating in, that becomes the dyad for each year that this movement is in existence. And then what happens is that sometimes those movements don't have any violent activity, and sometimes they do. And that's why, as I mentioned briefly, I included that. I think the other option would be to do kind of like what Bethany's done in the past and pick a specific country, with India, right, where, when you were looking at that federal reorganization, that AGPS piece, and you've got this clear set of all of the possible cases of mobilization, because, and I would love to hear suggestions on this, but I'm not sure how to handle all of the cases where nothing actually happens if I don't take one of those two approaches.
Joe, you have thoughts on this? Oh, wait, Janet has two fingers.
I was just going to say, I think a really promising direction for the data going forward would be to use, it doesn't fully, well, it would be to use accolade for your source of groups. And then, right, and then you can make it dyadic. So this is a lot of work, but I can tell you more about this offline, but I've been sort of mucking through accolade a lot. And I just think the better, in my mind, it's very hard to identify without doing a single case like Bethany did, which is a fine approach, or even, my work in Uganda. But if you want to do this more broad, to find the universe of groups that could mobilize, I think is often a very sort of dangerous road to go down, and to make the case that they were all the same in type, or they all were sort of same in terms of their potential goals. Like, I can go into it more, but I'm pretty uncomfortable with the use of self-determination groups and the assumption that groups that were territorial and that were not territorial could have, with sort of equal probability, experienced low intensity violence. I doubt that's true. I would guess that territorial ones from the very start planned to commit violence, and those that didn't don't, which is a pretty big empirical problem for your first stage. And you get around that if you use ACLID and you use the cases of all groups that committed at least one act of violence, right? Then you know that you're looking at all, groups that could have escalated to low intensity violence. And then I'd have to think about it for a lot of the coding, could already use, I think, David Cunningham's data, his dyadic data, his rebel government group data, and he tries to get at the relative capacity of those two groups, of the two parties. So you'd have a lot of it already coded for you. But for what it's worth, in my looking at ACLID, you'd pick up a lot of new groups that are not in the pre-OUCDP data that committed just one or two or a handful of acts of violence and didn't make it to the low intensity violence threshold. So I think it could be an onerous but really promising way to move forward with the data.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I didn't realize the threshold was quite that different these days. And I think that would get around the issues quite nicely.
Yeah. I don't know how long you want to be in grad school for, because it wouldn't be that
bad. Joe, did you want to follow up? And then I got Bill.
Say one quick thing on that, which is, all of these choices require trade-offs, right? I just think it's a huge trade-off to say, I'm actually looking at these group state dyads, but then I'm using movement, which is a different unit of observation. And the other thing is, I think, it's tough to figure out what the zero is, the inactive type, but I would be more comfortable not including some of those zeros than I would be, for example, Asian Americans in the US, we don't maybe need to have that movement or group in a data set because they're not really restive in any kind of meaningful way, where if we have like ACLID groups, we will have, maybe most of them are using violence already, but it's, I think, more fruitful.
Bethany?
So, I'm making noise? Okay. One thing you could do, like this issue of what are my zeros, actually only comes up with the territorial wars. Like the zero for those center-seeking wars, it's always just all the countries that don't have a war, because, right, it's just the one central government. And it strikes me that might be your cleanest possible research design, and you could match the ACLID groups really easily, if it's, they too have that center-seeking versus territorial distinction, so you could easily know what ACLID groups were relevant to your question. And then the other thing that might be good about jumping to looking at center-seeking groups is that most really big civil wars are center-seeking. So you kind of dodge around a potential objection you might get now, which is that, look, these self-determination wars, they just don't escalate that often. So why are you missing all our real variation or whatever?
Katie.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
It's just your turn. If you want to respond to Joe and Bethany, and it's okay if not.
I think I'll just say I do understand where the concern is coming from. I think part of it is I will try to be a little bit clearer in the description of the write-up as far as what's going on, because I don't think there's as much movement across units as maybe it comes off. But I do like the idea of obviously being able to test this out on a couple of very different data sets and a couple of very different approaches that have a similarly clean way at getting at the questions, that would also make me feel, more confident in the results that I'm seeing. So I definitely appreciate those suggestions.
Two finger from Janet.
This is quite small, but just on the topic of what's going on, as you said, I just thought there were very few actual even names, like proper nouns in the paper, and it just made it hard for me to fully understand what was going on. And so a lot of different ways you could do this. I don't think you need full-blown case studies, but even just in the discussion of the results to look under the hood and tell us, for example, here's a self-determination movement that did not control territory, and here's what happened, in 3 sentences, and then they did, and just to walk us through a couple of illustrative examples of what we're seeing in the data would help, I think, fix ideas a lot.
Bill.
Okay, I wanted to talk some more about trade-offs, specifically with respect to the statistical analysis that you did in the paper. And I think that, I hate to even say it, I don't like saying selection effects or bias or endogeneity. It kind of hurts my ears a little bit, but I think it's worth talking about that you really have two different problems. And they're both a kind of an excluded variable problem. The one that you corrected for is that there are unobserved factors that are related to getting involved in low-level conflict, and those are also related to war. So you adjust for that in the second stage. The other problem is that if you're a strategic person, there's stuff going on in the war decision that affects your decision to get involved in low-level conflict. And those are very different dynamics, and it's worth separating them out, at least conceptually, because you can't really deal with them simultaneously in an empirical setup, but you can at least distinguish between the two conceptually. And then in terms of just some of the mechanics of the analysis, so in some of the tables, like in table 4, you report a row of -1.14. Row can only go between -1 and +1. So I don't know if this is the IMR. And then in tables 2 and 3, you report row and IMR, and they can't be in the same model. And then in table 3, you have the coefficients changing sign. I think that's the table where they change sign in the second stage. The reason that you get those monotonic effects is because of the sign of row. So if row is negative, the coefficients in the second stage will change sign. If it's positive, they won't. That's just a function of the likelihood function itself. So when you see it not happening or see it happening and that condition isn't met, it makes me kind of wonder what's going on with the empirical analysis. And this may be that you just didn't have enough time to describe how you did the estimation, because you mentioned you did a 2-stage approach, which would lead to using the IMR, where full information would be using row. So maybe you can clarify that. If not fully here, certainly when you do the revisions, you want to make sure you get that done. Because these models are somewhat notoriously known for the sign switching, and that being an artifact of row being misestimated.
Right. So I'll try and take these roughly in order. I can definitely include a discussion that distinguishes conceptually between the two different issues at play. I wasn't sure, so just from space constraint perspectives, if that would be something that's as useful, or if it would, be better maybe in an appendix. But I'm happy to include that if you think that would help clarify things. I actually completely take your point about the strategic issues. So just a brief bit of context, this project is part of my dissertation more broadly. And one of the next steps that I'm going to be working on is an empirical approach that can handle both of these concerns together, because you already flagged it. The Hencken does have its concerns, and it can be difficult to work with. And so I have tried to address that a little bit. I've run some robustness checks with other types of models, and the results are generally consistent. But it's definitely not the ideal approach, I don't think. And to get into a little bit more of the weeds that you were raising, so the row of -1.1 in that table 4, the reason why that's obviously out of bounds of what row typically could be is because, so in that set of analyses, what I was trying to do was compare as closely as possible this Hencken approach to the traditional probate models of war. And I wanted to do that because I was worried that people would say, oh, well, you're getting these, you know, wonky results with the Hencken models, not because there's, you know, an inherent selection bias or something like that, but because you're using this different set of cases, and how can we be sure that, you know, this GDP per capita stuff or these territorial base findings or whatever are because of the approach that you're taking, and not just because you're using a different case set. And so in that set of analyses, I try and pick country level controls that are the most consistent with that early Civil War onset literature. And I run probate model for low intensity violence and a probate model for war, and then compare those to a Hencken selection model with the same variables. To make that comparison as close as possible, I don't include an exclusion restriction. And so obviously that violates some of the assumptions of the Hencken selection model. And so that's why you get that really wonky row. And so I did that deliberately because I wanted to try and, like I said, convince people that might be skeptical that this is why I was getting the results I was getting. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, I think if you wanted to do that, what I would do is just fix row at 1 instead of trying to estimate it. So if you do kind of like what Ann Sartori did in her estimator, and I don't know what program you use to do this stuff, but most programs allow you to put a constraint on a parameter. So that would be a more you know, solid way to do it, in terms of how referees would potentially view it, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Joe.
So I should just say Bill's a likely referee, so that's probably good advice. Related, I mean, I think it's always ambitious to do EITM. It was kind of the fad for a while, but people have walked away from it, partially because it's so damn hard. But I feel like that you're stuck a little bit between wanting to redo what's already been done in the Civil War literature, which is very not EITM. It's a basket of variables, versus your formal model. And, you know, in your formal model, the state's repressing and accommodating. That's not happening in the statistical model, right? And so for me, I would, yeah, it's nice to see maybe those replications, but I'd like to see models, statistical models that match the formal model.
Okay. And by that, you mean where dichotomous trade-off, like in the model? Yeah,
I mean, it'd be nice. I mean, and there's plenty of data you can get on state accommodation or state repression. You know, that's just one example.
Understood.
Oh, thank you. Janet? Oh, I didn't know if you were leaning forward to take on a point.
No, sorry, I'm going back to my notes to refresh my memory of what I haven't already shared.
Okay. Yeah, Joe.
I'll jump in again. I've got several other things. One thing to think about too is, you know, I think a big weakness in that early Civil War literature is about state capacity. And GDP for me is a really bad indicator of it. But I think, you know, a little more conceptual clarity about what state capacity is. Are we really talking about the repressive capacity of the state? And if that's what we're talking about, what's maybe a better measure of that than GDP? I mean, it's highly likely that's going to correlate with it, but still just kind of sharpening that. And right, Cullen Hendricks' work is really helpful here.
Agreed. So one thing that I was really hoping to squeak in the round of edits for this version of the paper, and I just didn't quite get to, is I am running additional analysis using Cullen Hendricks' data set, trying to dig into some additional measures of state capacity and to see kind of where things hold and where they don't. Because I actually think both cases would be informative here. And so, yes, that is in the works. But thank you.
Any other big points? Oh, Bethany, and then Janet.
How should I think about the difference between the decision to escalate a war and a war that just lasts a really long time? Because there's right, two different ways to get to 1,000 battle deaths. And you'd mentioned you're going to think about a new estimator, so I was trying to kind of figure out what's the natural data generating process, and that's as far as I got. Like, are we like proxying for duration, or do we actually have like a jump that is escalation?
Yeah, so what I'm currently using is the more restrictive annual rather than cumulative. The duration question is one that I find really interesting. I think where I'll wind up actually trying to go with the new estimator is not as much duration, but rather, right, so right now I look at things as one direction, right? So low intensity violence escalates to war, but in reality, it can cycle through a bit, right? So there's fluctuations in intensity levels and it increases and decreases. And ideally, what I'd really like to be able to do is develop something that can handle that and that can go both ways.
Janet?
Yes, just first one small thing is I didn't see anywhere any interpretation of substance interpretation of the effects of any of your models. Forgive me if I missed it, but I didn't see it, and I just think it's always a best practice to add a little bit of that so we can understand what are the magnitude of the effects that we're seeing. And second, and this is more I just be interested in where the paper is and what you're planning to do with it. But I think if you plan to send this to a conflict journal, then you can discount what I'm about to say, because I think everyone in the conflict world will read the motivation for your paper and just get it and be sold, I think. But if you go for a more broad disciplinary journal, which I think you could, because you're making a really this is potentially a very important literature to a very just sort of core question of political science, right? How do we understand the start of civil wars? And if you do, I would urge you to do even more, not only in building in some proper nouns, but also mentioning a little bit about the sort of basic policy implications and or potential contribution to knowledge here. Like you mentioned a lot of the inferential problems and biases that result from the way conflict onset's been studied, right? But something you nodded to very briefly in your presentation, but is very important, right, is that if you wanted to prevent conflict, right, you have to understand these mechanics of how it starts, right? And if you only start looking at 1,000 battle deaths, right, you've missed probably, an enormous amount of the action. And right, and if you want to prevent conflict, you have to look at all the action that leads up to it. And so I would just not underestimate the importance of doing that in a really clear way if you end up going for a broader political science journal.
Thank you. That's helpful. So one of the things that I definitely struggle with is how much to try and sell the overall framing and what kind of claims to try and make, especially with regards to policy relevance and everything like that. I think it's probably a component of being a grad student and not wanting to try and overclaim anything. But I mean, I honestly believe what I said during the presentation about the policy implications, and it's reassuring to hear that you would echo that. So I can certainly include that into the introduction and framing. And I do apologize about the substantive effects. I have moved the empirical analysis and section around a bunch, and I will make sure that they are included. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Do we have any last points that anyone would like to bring up? Bill?
I just wanted to say, you know, this is speaking to Joe's discussion about the EITM approach. I think for many of us, that approach is close to our heart, but you can see what a challenge it is to try and get this, a formal model, some empirical analysis, policy prescriptions, data contribution, all into a single paper that you can get published in one of the top 3 journals, given the way that these journals are pushing down the page numbers now. And I think that you may come to a point where you're going to have to make some hard choices. One of those choices may be to drop the empirical analysis and fully solve the model and do all the comparative statics and actually interpret the model fully, or remove it from the paper and, you know, just have an empirical paper. And I feel awful saying that, because I think philosophically it's kind of against how I think that people should be I think it's a plausible way for people to do their research, that they should be able to combine these two. But it's really difficult to get what's considered a best practices formal model and a best practices empirical model into a paper together where the formal theory people and the empirical people all agree that it's good enough to get published. That's not good. There's no advice in there.
I'll two finger on that, and then Bethany has a two finger too, which is that there's also a delicate balance that can be played, or a delicate dance you can do, which is that you can, if you're a fantastic writer or get lots of advice, you can omit pieces of both and put them in a very extensive appendix. So you can explain the intuition of a formal model and then put the entirety of the formal model in your appendix, right? Gilligan does a really nice job of doing this sometimes, which is that he basically outlines the intuition or the story of the model and tells you what's really pulling at the tensions and how it works, but puts the actual formal model in the appendix. And you can do something similar with the estimates, which is describe what you're doing and put just substantive results in the actual article, and then put the estimates, the tables, etc., in the appendix. Now, I don't know how many reviewers go for this. I go for it when I'm a reviewer, but you can try it, you know, and so that you are making the biggest contribution to science that you can in one paper, right? I think that if you go formal only or empirical only, I think those are really important contributions. I think it's going to be harder to publish in the general journals because the contribution doesn't feel as big. So you can do it with this like cutting and pasting as long as you have a lot of smoothness in your writing and a lot of clear exposition. So, Bethany, did you have a thought on this?
It's but it's going to be the exact opposite, which always what happens. Like 100% of the times I have submitted to a general journal, I've been told to take formal theory out of things. And, you know, I once was told to add a case study. So my experience has been like, you need to, like that formal theory is not generally that helpful, but small n problems here. It strikes me that like if you're going to do just the empirics, the natural framing is we need to think really seriously about escalation as something different from onset, and then or I guess yeah. So that's a framing of what's the puzzle here. the current framing has an idea that I think is right in it, which is that the information environment is so profoundly bad when it comes to internal war, and profoundly bad in a way that interstate war just doesn't think about. And that's a natural hook if you want to do a standalone formal theory paper. I honestly don't recommend that. Like information models have a lot of weird quirks, and I sort of feel like even if you can't model it, if you can tell a story about like I think you're fundamentally right that the kind of information governments have about their citizens is a mess, and it's so much more complicated than the way you set up a formal model with like 2 types, 3 types. And all these information models always have the problem that the informational problems collapse really, really quickly. Like they're very easy to solve. And so you've got really difficult models on a technical level that imply that the world is simple and end up producing no conflict. Like that happens over and over and over with these things. And I guess I would push you to like think about, so what do you think actually would be different about the way we thought about civil war if we really focused on that terrible information environment, and try not to get too hampered by how bad formal theory is in terms of capturing our intuitions about information.
Thank you, all of you. I really actually appreciate this part of the discussion because I've struggled with including the formal model or not. And so in the dissertation, there are 2 separate chapters. And I didn't really feel as confident that either, I think they complement each other, right? And so I like, Emily's suggestion potentially to maybe include more things in the appendix, potentially, there's a few different possibilities here that I think are worth exploring. I'm very hesitant to have it be just empirics about, oh, these are 2 different stages, because I think that's true and an important contribution, but the informational environment is a story that I am particularly interested in. And so I do appreciate the multiple different pathways to get there that you guys have suggested. It's definitely helpful.
Thank you to everybody for participating today. Thank you to Katie for sharing your paper with us and presenting it and taking a barrage of comments. You've done an excellent job. So thank you for joining us. And a reminder to anybody who's watching that the manuscript of this paper is available on the online Peace Science Colloquium website. So you can just Google us and you'll be able to find it over there. So you can read it yourself and share comments with Katie via email. I'd like to thank our discussants for doing an excellent job, and thank you for reading it closely and providing excellent comments on both the theory and the empirics and the framing and the target and all of that for Katie. So thank you to Bethany, to Janet, to Joe, and to Bill for joining us today. And that's it for the semester, for the academic year. I'd like to thank everybody who's been following us throughout the year. we'll start up again in the fall. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank Peter Carey, who is always in the background for every time we do this, who runs our show technically and substantively, and he's been doing a great job for me for 3 years, and this is our final show. So thank you to Peter. I won't embarrass him by showing him, but I very much appreciate all the work that he's done for the past 3 years. So with that, I will let everybody go, and we'll see you again in the fall.